The room went quiet the moment I pushed open those heavy mahogany doors. My son Ryan was already seated at the plaintiff's table, and when he saw me walk in, something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, more like the satisfied expression of a man who believes the hard part is already over. His wife Claire sat beside him, perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly over a leather portfolio, her eyes forward. Neither of them stood up. Judge Patron was reviewing documents exhibits at bands. She glanced up the way judges do when someone enters a room they control, and then she stopped. She set her pen down slowly. "Helen," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Special Agent Mercer." Every head in the courtroom turned. Ryan's expression collapsed so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Claire's hands went still on that leather portfolio. Their attorney, a sharp-looking man in his late 30s named Bradford, who'd been exuding confidence all morning, looked from the judge to me and back again like he was trying to solve an equation that kept changing variables. Nobody in that room knew who I was. Not really. They'd looked at me and seen exactly what they expected to see. A 65-year-old widow, a woman who forgot where she put her reading glasses, a woman who needed help. They forgot to ask what I did for 32 years before I came home to Atlanta to take care of my husband. Let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without it. My name is Helen Mercer, and for 32 years I worked as a special agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Most people don't know that the IRS has agents. They think of auditors, gray cubicles, forms in triplicate. They don't think about the people who track down tax fraud, money laundering, offshore accounts hidden behind shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They don't think about the agents who followed money trails across 3 continents and put white-collar criminals in federal prison for decades. I was one of those agents. My colleagues called me the Ledger because I had a gift for finding the one transaction in 10,000 that didn't belong. The one number that was slightly off. The one wire transfer routed through an account that had no business existing. I could look at financial records the way other people read a novel, following the story, feeling the tension, knowing before the last chapter exactly how it would end. I retired at 63, not because I wanted to. My husband Thomas had been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition 2 years before, and by the time I turned 62, he needed full-time care. Thomas had spent 30 years supporting my career. He raised our son largely on his own during the stretches when I was traveling for cases. He'd never once asked me to choose. It was the least I could do to choose him now. We lived in a Victorian house in Decatur, just outside Atlanta. Thomas had spent years restoring it, the original hardwood floors, the wraparound porch, the pocket doors between the parlor and the dining room. Even when the illness made it hard for him to speak clearly, he'd sit on that porch in the evenings and look out at the yard with a kind of deep contentment. The house was his life's work in ways his career never was. Thomas passed away 14 months ago. Congestive heart failure in the end. I sat beside him and held his hand and felt the particular silence that fills a room when someone you've loved for 38 years takes their last breath. I've seen death in my career. I'd worked cases where death was the endpoint of someone else's greed. But nothing prepares you for the specific weight of that silence when it belongs to you. Ryan came to the funeral with Claire and their daughter Lily. Lily was 14 then, a quiet, watchful girl who reminded me of myself at that age. She sat beside me through the service and didn't try to fill the silence with words, which was exactly right. Ryan and I had never been particularly close. My career made sure of that. He'd grown up with a mother who missed school plays for depositions and who came home from trips looking like she'd been somewhere she couldn't talk about. We had a cordial, careful relationship, the kind you build over years of trying to make up for distance without ever fully closing it. Claire, I'd known for 4 years. She was an estate planning attorney at a mid-sized firm in Buckhead, polished and precise, with the particular composure of someone who trained themselves never to react before deciding how to react. I'd run a background check on her the week after Ryan introduced us. Old habit, nothing alarming. A solid career, a few old debts cleared, and expensive taste in things that her salary mostly covered. In the months after Thomas died, Ryan and Claire began visiting more often. At first, it felt like grief support. They'd come on Sundays, bring food, sit with me in the parlor. But I'd spent 32 years reading behavior, and something about their visits had a quality I recognized from work. A systematic quality. They moved through my house like they were taking inventory. Claire would pause in the doorway of Thomas's study and look at the bookshelves. Ryan would comment on the driveway needing resurfacing, the gutters needing cleaning, the upstairs bathroom with the slow drain I'd been meaning to fix. The concerned phone calls started in month 3. Was I managing the utility bills okay? Had I renewed my car registration? Did I know there was a frost advisory tonight? Had I brought in the plants on the porch? The questions felt rehearsed. 6 months after Thomas's funeral, they took me to town. Claire ordered appetizers for the table without asking what anyone wanted. Over the main course, they presented their idea. The house was too large for me to manage alone. They'd found a wonderful continuing care community in Buckhead, independent living apartments, everything maintained for you, activities, social connections. They would be happy to help manage the financial transition, handle the sale of the house, make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by all those moving parts. I thanked them for thinking of me, told them I was perfectly comfortable where I was. Thomas's pension and my federal retirement put me in very solid financial standing, and the house was paid off. Claire's smile stayed exactly the same, which is how I knew it wasn't real. Ryan said they understood, of course, and they'd revisit it whenever I felt ready. I knew we were not done. I started paying attention the way I used to on cases. Precise, systematic attention. Ryan began mentioning things I'd supposedly forgotten. Hadn't I said I'd call him last Thursday? Didn't I mention last week that I was having trouble keeping track of my medications? I kept a journal, had kept one for years, a habit from the job, and I checked it obsessively. I hadn't said any of those things. He was manufacturing a history that didn't exist. Claire began tidying during visits. Just straightening up a bit, Helen. She'd move items from where I kept them, reading glasses to a different side table, mail to a different spot on the kitchen counter, and then Ryan would mention on his next visit that I seemed to be misplacing things. I started photographing every room before they arrived. My granddaughter Lily noticed the tension. She was 15 by then, sharp and observant in that particular way of teenagers who've grown up watching adults carefully because adults are unreliable. She'd watch her parents move through my house with an expression I recognized. She'd corner me in the kitchen on the way out and ask quiet questions. Grandma, do you actually forget things, or are they just saying that? I told her the truth. I don't forget things. I told her about the journal, the photographs. She listened the way Thomas used to listen, completely still, fully present. She believed me. The guardianship petition arrived 8 months after Thomas died. Ryan and Claire were claiming I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The evidence packet their attorney had assembled included photographs of my supposedly disorganized home, a signed statement from Ryan detailing 11 incidents of memory failure, and a medical form bearing the signature of a Dr. Vincent Hale claiming I had missed 2 consecutive evaluation appointments. I had never made any such appointments. I had never heard of Dr. Vincent Hale. A social worker named Angela came to assess me. She was thorough and kind, with a clipboard and careful questions and the particular gentleness of someone who'd seen a lot of lonely old people in big houses. I could see what she was seeing: a widow, a woman still processing grief, someone who might genuinely benefit from a smaller space and more support. I gave her just enough. I let myself seem slightly uncertain on a few dates. I mentioned that I sometimes lost track of what day it was since Thomas passed, which was true. I said I'd been having some trouble with the new phone Ryan had given me last Christmas, which was also true because it was a perfectly good phone that I'd simply chosen not to learn because I preferred my old one. Angela noted concerns on her evaluation form and recommended follow-up visits. Because by the time Angela arrived, I already knew what Claire had been doing. It had started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd been upstairs when Claire arrived one Sunday ahead of Ryan. She let herself in. They had a key, which I'd given them before I understood what they intended to use it for, and she took a call in my kitchen, apparently assuming I was still in the garden. I came downstairs quietly. I'd done that professionally for 32 years. People who think they're alone talk freely. She was discussing a trust account, not her own. The language was precise enough that I recognized it. Disbursement timing, commingled funds, the phrase before the estate closes. Her tone was low and controlled, the voice of someone managing something that required management. I went back upstairs. That night, I pulled out old habits from 32 years of work, the way you pull out a tool you haven't needed for a while but never forgot how to use. I called a former colleague at the Atlanta field office. Just a social call, catching up. How's your caseload? The kind of conversation that two people who worked in the same field for decades know how to have. I mentioned I'd been thinking about estate fraud, the patterns, whether it was still as common in probate cases as it had been when I was working. He told me more than I needed to know to confirm what I suspected. I started with public records. Georgia probate filings are accessible to anyone who knows where to look, and I knew exactly where to look. Claire's firm specialized in estate planning and probate administration. I pulled 3 years of cases where she was listed as the administrator of record, 8 cases. 7 had closed cleanly with no disputes. 1 was still open, a case involving the estate of a woman named Martha Calloway, whose adult children had filed a complaint about discrepancies in the trust disbursements. The complaint had been dismissed 6 months earlier. Filed, reviewed, dismissed. I knew how to read that. I reached out to the Calloway family. Not as anyone official, I was retired, I had no authority, and I was careful about that. I told them I was a former federal financial investigator who'd retired to Atlanta and happened to come across their case in public records, and I was curious about the nature of the discrepancy they'd reported. Was there anything they'd been unable to document clearly? Martha Calloway's daughter, a woman named Denise, had been waiting 14 months for someone to take her seriously. She talked for 2 hours, which she described was elegant in its construction. Claire had administered the Calloway estate following Martha's death. The estate was valued at approximately $1.4 million, a house, investment accounts, a small business interest. Claire had taken her administrator's fee, which was documented and correct. But buried in the disbursement records Denise had finally obtained were 47 smaller transactions, each under $10,000, each routed through a management account Claire controlled, each marked as estate expenses, with vague descriptions like property maintenance coordination and asset valuation services. The total was $287,000 over 14 months. Denise had hired a CPA who flagged the transactions. The CPA's report had been included in the complaint. The court had accepted Claire's response, a detailed letter explaining each charge with accompanying invoices, and dismissed the case. I asked Denise to send me copies of everything. The original disbursement records, the CPA report, Claire's response, the invoices Claire had submitted. I spent 3 days going through them. The invoices were good, not perfect, but good. Vendor names, service descriptions, dates that aligned with the estate timeline. Someone had put real effort into them. But I'd spent 32 years looking at constructed paper trails, and constructed paper trails have a signature quality. They're too consistent. Real expenses have irregularities. Real invoices come from vendors with slightly different formatting, occasional typos, inconsistent fonts. Claire's invoices were uniform in a way that real vendor documentation almost never is. I ran the vendor names against Georgia's Secretary of State business registrations. Of 47 vendors listed, 31 existed. 16 did not. I pulled the bank records Denise had on the receiving end of those payments. 16 transactions totaling $94,000 had gone to accounts registered to LLCs that had been formed within the previous 2 years, operated for less than a year, and dissolved. Standard structure for disbursing embezzled funds cleanly. Then I found Rifefound's name. It was in one of the dissolved LLCs, a member listed on the original formation documents before the company was amended 3 months later to remove his name. Whether he'd understood what the entity was being used for, I didn't know yet. But his name was on a piece of paper that connected him to money that shouldn't have existed. I needed to be very careful about what came next. I borrowed a digital recorder from a former colleague, federal grade, the kind that slips into a cardigan pocket and produces courtroom admissible audio. In Georgia, one party consent applies. As long as I was party to the conversation, I could record it. I deepened my performance. During visits, I became more confused. I'd ask what day the trash collection was, something I'd known for 11 years. I'd start a sentence and trail off. I refer to something Thomas used to do in the present tense, then correct myself with visible distress. Ryan relaxed visibly. Claire stopped being careful around me. She took phone calls in my kitchen with the confidence of someone who decided the person in the next room wasn't processing at full capacity. I recorded 12 conversations over the following 6 weeks. The most important one happened on a Tuesday afternoon when they thought I'd gone upstairs to lie down. I was in the hallway, recorder running, listening to Claire explain to Ryan in the particular clipped sentences of someone who'd rehearsed their anxiety management that the Hartley estate was closing in 10 weeks and the final accounting needed to be submitted before that, and that if the guardianship moved forward on schedule, they'd have access to the house equity in time to move the necessary funds before her firm's annual compliance review. Ryan said, "What if she contests it again?" Claire said, "She can't contest anything if she's been declared incompetent, Ryan. That's the entire point." There was a pause. Ryan said, "I just want to make sure this is the right thing for her." Claire said, "It is. She's alone in that house. She's getting older. She's not managing well. We're doing the right thing and solving a problem at the same time. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." I stood in that hallway and thought about a lot of things. About Thomas, about the house he'd rebuilt with his hands, about what Ryan might have known and when he'd known it, about the fact that Claire was right that I was alone in a big house and getting older, that those parts of her justification were true, and how the true parts of a lie are always the most dangerous parts. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed Thomas and I had shared for 38 years. I let myself feel the full weight of what was happening for exactly 4 minutes. I timed it on my watch, which I'd started doing in the early years of my career, when I noticed that grief, like everything else, moved faster when you gave it a container. Then I called my attorney. Frank Delacroix was 70 years old, had practiced law in Atlanta for 43 years, and had been my husband's closest friend since law school. He had a face like a comfortable chair and a legal mind that had never once lost a case where the facts supported his client. I'd called him 3 weeks earlier to tell him what I suspected. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, and said, "Keep building it. Call me when you're ready." I told him I was ready. 2 weeks later, we were in Judge Odom's courtroom. I'd appeared before Patricia Odom twice during my career. She'd been a federal district judge during the last 8 years before I retired, and I'd testified in 2 of her cases involving complex financial fraud. She had a reputation for patience during proceedings and absolute precision in her rulings, and she had no tolerance for anything that wasted her time or insulted her intelligence. She hadn't recognized me when I walked in because she hadn't expected to see me. I was in a sensible cardigan and slacks, moving slowly, carrying my reading glasses case in one hand like I wasn't entirely sure why I was holding it. I learned in 32 years that people see what they expect to see. Ryan and Claire's attorney expected a confused elderly woman. He got one, right up until he didn't. Bradford presented their case first. He was competent. The documentation of my supposed memory failures was organized and thorough. The social worker's testimony was delivered carefully and without exaggeration. She was too professional for that. But the concerns she'd noted were enough to establish reasonable grounds for the petition. The doctor whose name appeared on the medical form testified that I had failed to follow through on cognitive screenings he'd recommended, which was technically accurate in the sense that I had never agreed to them in the first place. Ryan testified. He was composed and genuinely sorrowful looking, describing 11 incidents over 8 months in which his mother had seemed confused, disoriented, or unable to recall conversations they'd had. He was a good witness. He'd been coached well. Claire did not testify. That was the right instinct. Then Frank stood up. "The defense would like to call the respondent herself," he said. Bradford objected on grounds that no witness had been disclosed. Frank produced the disclosure notice filed 48 hours earlier, which Bradford had apparently not read carefully. Judge Odom looked at it, looked at Bradford with an expression that conveyed no sympathy, and told me to take the stand. I walked to the stand the way I used to walk into interviews, unhurried, upright, with the particular stillness that comes from having no anxiety about the outcome because you know what the evidence says. I heard the moment Judge Odom recognized me. It was in the pause before she said my name. Helen, she said, Special Agent Mercer. I said, Your Honor, I should clarify for the record that I retired from federal service 2 years ago. I'm simply a private citizen today. But you didn't act? It's been a long time. The room had the particular quality of a space where everyone is recalibrating simultaneously. Your Honor, Frank said, the respondent would like to address the court directly regarding the nature of this petition and certain matters that have come to the court's attention. Judge Odom nodded once. I thanked the court for its time. I acknowledged that the petition before us represented genuine concern for an elderly widow living alone, and that on its surface, the documented incidents might well indicate a woman in cognitive decline. I acknowledged that the social worker's evaluation had been conducted professionally and in good faith. Then I said, however, the petition is fraudulent, and I can prove it in approximately 40 minutes. Bradford was on his feet immediately. Ryan's face had gone the particular shade of someone trying to decide whether to run. I'll allow it, Judge Odom said quietly without looking up from her notes. Proceed, Mrs. Mercer. I asked Frank to connect my audio device to the court system. He'd arranged clearance for this 2 days earlier. I'll play 3 recordings, I said. All were made in my home during conversations to which I was a party under Georgia's one-party consent statute. I'd like to start with the most recent. Claire's voice filled the courtroom. The flat, careful efficiency of it, the audit timeline, the estate closing. The phrase, we're doing the right thing and solving a problem at the same time. Ryan looked at the table in front of him. He did not look at Claire. Claire looked straight ahead. She was extraordinary under pressure. I had to give her that. I played the second recording, a conversation from 3 weeks earlier in which Claire described the structure she'd used for the Callaway disbursements to someone on the phone whose voice I didn't have clearly enough to identify, but whose role was obvious from context. She used a phrase I'd waited 3 weeks to hear her use, the management account model. I played the third recording last because it was the longest and the most damaging. 41 minutes of a Sunday afternoon conversation in which Claire walked Ryan through the guardianship timeline, the sale timeline, the fund movement timeline, and the compliance review window with the precision of someone who had engineered all of it from the beginning. When it finished, the courtroom had the specific silence of a room in which the air has changed. I then presented the financial documentation. I prepared 4 exhibits, the Callaway disbursement records, the CPA analysis, the vendor registration research I conducted, and a detailed summary of the 16 transactions to the LLC accounts, including the formation documents bearing Ryan's name. I want to be precise about my son's involvement, I said. His name appears on the formation documents of one entity used in this scheme. That entity was amended to remove his name 3 months after formation. Whether he understood the purpose of that entity or participated knowingly in its use is not for me to determine. That is a matter for law enforcement and, if warranted, the courts. What I can tell you is that he was aware his wife needed a substantial sum of money within a specific time frame, that he knew guardianship over me would provide access to that sum, and that he made a choice. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. My voice stayed level because I'd had months to find the level place in myself where this lived. You learn to do that in this work. You find the place below the feeling where the thinking can still function. You do what needs doing. You feel it later in the dark when no one is watching. Your Honor, Frank said, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of the guardianship petition and requests the court's assistance in referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for investigation of potential fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation. Judge Odom looked at Claire for a long moment. Claire met her gaze with professional steadiness. Whatever else she was, she had nerve. Miss Stafford, Judge Odom said, using Claire's professional name, I'm advising you to stop speaking. She turned to the bailiff. Please contact the Fulton County Prosecutor's Office and the Georgia Bar's Office of General Counsel. I'd like someone from each available as soon as possible. She looked at Ryan. Mr. Mercer, you are not currently the subject of criminal charges in this proceeding. I would strongly encourage you to obtain independent counsel immediately, as there is an obvious conflict of interest between your interests and those of your current representation. Ryan nodded. He looked like a man who'd arrived somewhere he never intended to go and couldn't find the way back. Petition dismissed, Judge Odom said. Mrs. Mercer, you're free to go. Frank touched my arm. That's it. It's done. I looked at my son one more time. He was still sitting at the plaintiff's table, hands flat on the surface in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Not younger, older somehow. The way people look when they've aged past a point they can't come back from in a single afternoon. In the gallery, my granddaughter Lily sat very still with her hands in her lap. She was 15, and she'd watched her grandmother dismantle her parents' scheme in 40 minutes with a recording device and 32 years of practice. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It was the complicated expression of someone who has just seen the world rearrange itself into a new shape and isn't sure yet what it means. I went to her. I'm okay, I said, because I knew that was the question she was holding. She put her arm through mine and didn't say anything. We walked out together. The weeks that followed moved the way these things do, in bursts of legal activity and then long silent stretches of waiting. Claire was arrested and charged with breach of fiduciary duty, elder financial exploitation, and fraud. The Georgia Bar opened disciplinary proceedings immediately. The firm she worked for placed her on administrative leave within 48 hours and hired outside counsel to conduct an internal review, which ultimately found that the Callaway case was not the only one. 3 additional estates showed similar patterns. The total figure across 4 cases was approximately $1.7 million over 4 years. Investigators found the LLC structure Ryan had been named in. He was questioned twice. The prosecutors determined he hadn't participated directly in the mechanics of the fraud. He hadn't known what the entity was used for until it was dissolved, and his participation appeared limited to being present for conversations he should have intervened in and didn't. He was not charged with a crime. He did lose his position at the investment management firm where he'd worked for 9 years. News of the guardianship case made the legal community rounds before he could get ahead of it. He moved into an apartment in Decatur. He started seeing a therapist. Lily asked to stay with me. She asked directly, in the particular straightforward way she had that reminded me of the agents I'd liked best over the years. No performant, no preamble, just the question. She said her parents' house didn't feel like home right now, and mine did. She said she wanted to go to school in Decatur, and she wanted to be close to me. I told her she was welcome for as long as she wanted. She took the guest room, the one with the window seat overlooking Thomas's garden. She hung a string of lights along the ceiling, put her books in the old shelving unit I'd had since before Ryan was born. Within 2 weeks, the room smelled like her, something herbal, something like her, something I paper. It became hers. She asked me questions late in the evenings when we were both in the living room. She asked them carefully, like she was arranging words she'd been holding for a long time. How did you know what Claire was doing? Was it just the phone call? The phone call confirmed a direction, I told her. But I'd seen the signs before that. The way she moved through this house like she was measuring it. The questions that were too specific to be casual. The visits that had a pattern instead of a warmth. When you spent 30 years tracking financial fraud, you learn that money crimes almost always start with someone who's good at performing legitimacy. Claire was very good at that, but performance has tells if you know what you're looking for. What are the tells? I thought about how to explain it to a 15-year-old. Anxiety that doesn't match the situation, I said. Someone being smoother than the moment calls for? The specific calm of a person who's already run the worst-case scenario in their head and decided they can manage it. Claire never reacted to anything in real time. Everything she said was already finished before she said it. Real people aren't like that. Real people are messy and inconsistent and sometimes surprised. Lily turned this over for a while. Did you know Dad knew? I chose my words carefully. I knew he was aware something was wrong before he told himself it was okay. There's a difference between being deceived and choosing to stay deceived. Your father made choices. He made them because he was afraid. Afraid of your mother leaving, afraid of financial trouble, afraid of failing. Fear makes people capable of things they'd never recognize in themselves. Is that forgivable? I don't know yet, I said. I think forgiveness is something you arrive at, not something you decide. You can't push yourself to it. You just have to leave the door open and see if you walk through it eventually. She went quiet for a bit. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. I'm angry at him, she said. I know, but I don't hate him. I know that too. She looked at her hands. Do you think he'll try to fix things? He's trying, I said. Whether the trying becomes something real, that takes longer than we've had. She wrote him a letter 2 weeks later. She brought it to me before she mailed it, not to ask permission, I thought, but to have a witness. It was 3 paragraphs, handwritten, measured, and honest in the way I was already coming to think of as distinctly hers. She said she was angry, and she said she still loved him, and she said she still loved him, and she said she thought he should know both things. I told her it was a good letter. She said, I learned something from watching you this year. I said, what's that? She said that the truth doesn't have to be cruel to be honest. Ryan came to the house on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the hearing. I'd known he was coming. He called the night before, and I appreciated that. I made coffee and we sat on the porch where Thomas used to sit in the evenings. He told me he'd been in therapy twice a week. He told me he'd been going through the timeline of the previous year and writing it down, not to manage it but to look at it clearly, the way his therapist had suggested. He told me there had been a moment, about 4 months before the petition was filed, when he'd understood clearly what Claire intended and had told himself that it might actually be what was best for everyone. He kept telling himself that it might actually be what was best for everyone. He kept telling himself that until he believed it. I know that's not God. I know it's just an explanation of a failure. Yes, I said. He looked at the yard. Thomas's rose bushes were coming in. I've been taking better care of them this spring than I had in years. I spent so much of my childhood waiting for you to come home from cases, he said. Not angrily, just as a fact. I spent a lot of years deciding it didn't matter, that I was fine, that your career was important, and I understood. And then when I was grown and you were finally just my mother, I didn't know how to be your son. I didn't know how to close a distance that had been there the whole time. I said I missed things I shouldn't have missed. That's true, he said. I used that to tell myself you didn't need what I thought you needed. I turned my own old feelings into permission. I sat with that. I'd had months to sit with it, to look at my own part, the distance I'd built and called necessary and never quite closed when the necessity passed. My son had grown up watching me leave and come home and leave again, and somewhere in there he'd learned to treat the people in his life as problems to be managed rather than people to be present with. I'd modeled that, not intentionally, not maliciously, but there it was. I'm not excused, but I'm also not pretending I didn't leave gaps that someone else filled badly. He nodded. He looked older than 44. He looked like someone who was doing the slow, effortful work of becoming more honest with himself, which is the hardest work there is because you can't check it off a list. I told him he could start calling on Sundays. Not visiting yet, just calling. That we could build something in the time we had, if he was willing to do it without shortcuts. He said he was willing. He said, Lily sent me a letter. I know, I said. He said, she's remarkable. I said, she gets that from her grandfather. He smiled a little for the first time. I'd forgotten what his real smile looked like. Not the performed warmth he used socially, but the off-guard version that moved his whole face. Thomas's smile. He had his father's smile. He left after an hour. I watched him walk to his car, and he looked like what he was, a man with a lot of ground to recover, carrying it steadily enough that you could see he thought about it and decided he was going to try anyway. There's a particular quality to starting over at 65. It isn't what the self-help books describe. It isn't dramatic. It's quieter than that. It's your granddaughter putting her homework on the kitchen table while you make dinner. It's the phone call on Sunday from your son, who is choosing his words more carefully than he used to. It's the morning coffee on the porch where Thomas used to sit, the spring air carrying whatever the roses have come to. I got a letter from my former supervisor at the field office. He'd heard about the case. People talk, especially in legal and law enforcement circles. And he'd written to say something I hadn't expected. He said the methodology I described in the court documents was as precise as anything he'd seen from active agents. He said the case file I'd assembled was the kind of work they didn't teach anymore because they assumed it required the kind of patience that wasn't sustainable in modern caseloads. He asked if I'd be interested in consulting. Cold cases only, no field work, working from home at whatever pace suited me. Just the financial records, the paper trails, the ones that had gone cold because nobody had taken the time to look at them the way they deserved to be looked at. I thought about it for 2 days. Lily found the letter on the kitchen table and read it over my shoulder. "Are you going to say yes?" I told her I was thinking about it. She said, "You should. You're good at it, and it matters." I said, "What about being your grandmother?" "Does that leave enough time for that?" She said, "You can do both." You always could. You just had to find the right ratio. She was right, which is something I was getting used to about her. I wrote back that same evening, told him I'd take a look at what he sent, one case at a time, on my terms, at my pace, from the house Thomas built. That night, I sat in Thomas's chair with the lamp on and listened to the house settle around me. Decatur was quiet on weeknights. Lily was upstairs. The roses were coming in. Lily was upstairs. Somewhere in the city, Claire was in a jail facility awaiting trial, and Ryan was in his apartment working through whatever work needed to be done, and 3 families whose estates had been quietly drained were in the process of recovering what they were owed. I thought about what it meant to be underestimated, to have people look at you and see the cardigan, the reading glasses case, the widow in the big house, and decide that was the whole story. I'd spent 32 years being the person who came in after everyone had decided the story was over and showed them where the narrative had gone wrong. I'd done it for the federal government with resources and authority and a badge. And then, when the situation called for it, I'd done it alone in my kitchen with a recorder in my pocket and 32 years of knowing how to read a paper trail. Some people think that getting older means your knowledge becomes irrelevant, that the years accumulate like debt rather than asset. They see someone my age and imagine a countdown rather than a ledger. Ryan and Claire made that mistake. Claire because she was constitutionally incapable of seeing past the surface of people she'd decided weren't useful to her. Ryan because he'd spent too many years telling himself his mother had limits that she actually didn't have. They forgot that I'd spent 32 years watching people believe they were invisible. They forgot that the most thorough frauds are the ones nobody's looking for, and that nobody teaches you to look the way 32 years of looking teaches you. They forgot that I was the ledger, that I could find the one wrong number in 10,000, that I'd built cases against people far more careful and far more dangerous than a real estate attorney with a management account and a husband who'd stopped asking questions. By the time they remembered who they were dealing with, the recording was already made, the documents were already filed, and Patricia Odom's pen had already fallen still. I turned off the lamp and went upstairs to bed. Tomorrow, I'd call Frank to check on the case timeline. I'd make breakfast for Lily before she left for school. I'd take my coffee on the porch and look at Thomas's roses and think about what I owed the Hartley estate clients and what it would take to get them their money back. There was work to do. There was always work to do. I was exactly where I was supposed to be.